Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. I've been saying for years now that professional wrestling has better language, terminology, what have you, for narrative than most fiction writers talking about fiction, most fiction textbooks, fiction classes, what have you. Which is a claim that I'm sure will ruin my credibility entirely, but this is a bucket list series of videos, so who cares? Um, but really, and this is one of the craziest weeks for professional wrestling in the history of professional wrestling. Um, it's a golden era. I don't want to talk too much about that. Just I'm stretching my credibility enough just in the wild claim that it has better language. So let me start just with an example. If you're not convinced, which I'm sure most people probably won't be, um, but wrestling fans tend to be very humble. It is not the peak of culture in most people's eyes. So we don't tend to pretend like the thing we love is better than anybody else's thing. It's one of the most reviled of all of the art forms, but it is an art form, definitely. I don't feel that way. I don't think it should be with the most reviled, but it tends to be. And wrestling fans don't tend to be too braggadocious about it. Um, but I'll start with an example. I think the best example. If you're not convinced that wrestlers in wrestling fandom has better language for talking about narrative, let me start with one. The term mark. My dogs are going to make a lot of noise right now. Of course they're going to make a lot of noise. Siku. Siku. I got Siku from a wrestler, actually, named Anthony Henry. Siku, I'm talking about wrestling. I'm talking about wrestling. Mark, the verb mark. Mark is a fascinating word. And I think if you compare the verb mark to the phrase willful suspension of disbelief, I think mark as a verb is exponentially better concept or way of understanding the way narratives work than willful suspension of disbelief. Willful suspension of disbelief is such a horrible phrase, just to start with. Everybody uses it, and a lot of times we just shorten it to just suspension of disbelief, which is a terrible phrase, terribly inaccurate phrase. It comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I'll try to get some of my credibility back by dropping some knowledge about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Totally accidental rhyme there. But it comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and really the phrasing itself is a direct response to the Enlightenment era concept of the function of narrative, which, the Enlightenment era tended to focus more highly on science, philosophy, observable facts, that sort of thing. And so to say the willful suspension of disbelief really takes for granted that the automatic response of any sort of observer of something imaginative or fictional is going to be disbelief. So everybody's going to disbelieve something imaginative. So in order to really appreciate something imaginative, we have to willfully suspend that disbelief. Such an awkward phrase. And I love Samuel Taylor Coleridge, of the Romantics. He's one of the more imaginative of the Romantics, which I appreciate. But the phrasing is just terrible. And Keats, I reference negative capability all the time. Negative capability is very much present in most of wrestling. I don't think there's a direct correlation, but a lot of the concept of narrative in wrestling depends on negative capability. But that's such a not a clear phrase for what it means. So those two concepts, a lot of romantic concepts, are just intrinsic to the understanding of narrative from the perspective of wrestlers and wrestling fans. But mark is a much better word. And it has kind of a complicated permutation. Permutation's a word I overuse. But mark comes from Carney slang. Wrestling, a lot of wrestling terminology is rooted in Carney slang. And a mark is someone. My dogs are, of course, going to turn things chaotic. A mark is someone who's gullible and ready to believe a con. And so, if you're conning someone, as in, wrestling is a work, as they would say, it's not legitimately, it's a predetermined, so it's not legitimately a contest between two people who are trying to defeat each other. It's a work, meaning it is a narrative. It's fake is, people a lot of the times just throw out that word, right? Wrestling's fake. Well, isn't all narrative fake? That's such a dismissive oversimplification. But a mark is someone who's gullible and is ready to believe a con. But as it evolved over the years, this goes back 100 years. But as it evolved over the years, a mark is a fan who believes that the two wrestlers, or how many ever wrestlers, are genuinely trying to defeat each other. And so, the post kayfabe era, there's all kinds of terminology going in there. But the era, arguably after the 80s, when kayfabe became less important, just the need to maintain the facade that this is a genuine contest started to fade away. The term mark really came to refer to kids, basically. Just young kids. My son, Callum, who's 7, I'm not sure how much he really believes it. I suspect sometimes that he recognized, this is more like they're telling a story than they're actually trying to defeat each other. I suspect that he's been smartened up. That's the old Carney term for recognizing that something is a work. Smart up the marks. William S. Burroughs loved this terminology too. Not referring to wrestling, but referring to Carney cons and things like that. But the only ones who aren't smartened up are tend to be kids, and that's one of the reasons I like that as a terminology, because when you watch something in a wrestling match or in a show or in, however the storyline is presented, if you see something that you really love, the verb is then that you mark out. So just as an example, I always go to Mick Foley as an example. I think Mick Foley is one of the most admirable artists of any type of art, just in the history of art, because when he probably one of the first biggest moments of marking out after I had become smartened was when he won his world championship. This was when I was in college, because I was a fan off and on. I didn't think too much about it. But when I was really smartened up about, I became a smart mark, as fans are called. When I went from just being a casual fan. And that's the thing to always remember about just the nature of the narrative. The complexity of the narrative is based on the fact that it's being presented to essentially 3 main fan groups. The pure marks, really just the kids, people who believe it's genuine combat. The casual fans who recognize that it's a work, that it's a narrative, and just don't pay much attention to it really, and don't worry too much about the real story, or they just treat them as characters basically, and that's a big chunk of wrestling fans. The smart marks are the hardcore fans who recognize just all the complexity of all the narratives. When I became a smart mark was really in college, during what we call the Attitude Era. That's a whole thing. But when Mick Foley's kind of a dopey, kind of a character, kind of mentally unstable, kind of chubby. He's not the sort of guy who really obviously would be a heavyweight champion. And he won it from The Rock. The Rock, obviously big chiseled guy, really good looking guy. Two opposite characters in many ways. And he won, and Mick Foley won his championship from The Rock on an episode of Raw. And so that was at the point where I, was aware of the notion of marking out. That was a big mark out moment in January of '99, I think it was. Still for one of my favorite moments in wrestling, but I was aware of just the whole notion of what marking out means. But marking out means, this is why it works so much better as a concept to describe narrative than willful suspension of disbelief. Because the word as a verb, marking out, means you love a narrative moment so much that you disregard your natural skepticism. So, suspension of disbelief, it means essentially the same thing as suspension of disbelief, but it also takes for granted that our natural state is, as a smart mark, recognizing, yes, this is a narrative, I'll appreciate it somewhat passively, I won't really buy into the reality of it necessarily, I'll just appreciate, more objectively, I'll appreciate the story. But when you see something you truly, truly love, that turns you into a mark, basically, that turns you into... And one thing I love about it is also the association with childhood. It has intrinsic in the term that notion that you as a child just readily believe everything, that you are a mark, you're born a mark, and you readily believe everything. And it does have pejorative connotation, so it's not perfect. But you readily believe what you're presented, and you just open yourself up to it just naturally. I think it's an even more romantic notion. It fits with a lot of what Wordsworth said and a lot of what the Romantics said, to just automatically accept something as true. And then when you grow up, you become more skeptical. You start to recognize maybe it's a work, and you reject it, or you just appreciate it as a story. But when something just amazing happens, like, when... And, this year at WrestleMania, there were tons of just great mark-out moments. When Kofi Kingston won, huge mark-out moment. When Seth Rollins beat Brock Lesnar, it was a very face-heavy WrestleMania this year. Face-heavy meaning the good guys won more often than not. But anyway, so marking, I think, is a much better term. It's a much more concise term, more efficient term, more accurate term, arguably, than suspension of disbelief. Suspension of your skepticism. Suspension of your smartening up. Making yourself dumb, which I think is great. I think if you truly give your heart over to a narrative, if something truly convinces you as a piece of a narrative that it's not necessarily that it's true, but it's true in a narrative sense. It's so intensely emotional in a narrative sense that you give your heart over, you forget any sort of intellectual skepticism, you make yourself a child once again. So it's a much, much better term. So anyway, wrestling as an art form, it's the terminology that's really intrinsic to that. Is work and shoot, I think, are really handy terminology. Along with that, you have the notion of the worked shoot. There's not a direct correlation necessarily. You can see how it relates to negative capability, certainly. The whole notion of a worked shoot, especially, is an example of negative capability. But it's just really handy terminology. Hey, babe. If you think about... Oh, that's it. Okay, doggies, all the doggies coming in. But if you think about... I'm trying to talk here. I don't need to snuggle right now. Okay, where was I? Worked shoot, and worked shoot. Work is essentially synonymous with kayfabe. Kayfabe is old Carney terminology for fake. Carney language, you flip syllables around, and kayfabe, is just a word for fake. Work just means that you're working the crowd, you're conning the crowd, basically. And one of the really appealing things about that notion of work is just how much of wrestling terminology is is really associated with working or doing a job. For example, just the terminology for losing, which you don't really have that terminology in most other narrative, and you don't really need that terminology in most other narrative. But there's a whole complicated set of terms just for the notion of losing, just the whole idea that part of the job is for that somebody has to lose. So that gets shortened to jobbing. So if somebody's really good at wrestling, they're called a great worker, or they have great work rate, and so that's something I appreciate. Be still. That's something I appreciate as a writer. Just the importance of. Okay, get down. Just bundles of chaos. Bundles of chaos. I love you, but you're bundles of chaos. Are you coming back? Where was I? So the importance of work, and I think that's just great value system to really apply to any sort of art. And I think just in terms of what you're actually going to do to improve is just continuing to work. If somebody's a great worker, wrestlers tend to put a lot of emphasis on how great work rate ties with the more common definition of work. If somebody's a great worker, they worked really hard to get there. So there's lots and lots of emphasis on hard work and practice and constant practice, because most of it is improvised, which is the amazing thing about the artists I admire most in the entire world are wrestlers, because they'll tell a story, an improvised story. They'll tell this just amazing improvised story, and different parts of it are predetermined. The finish is predetermined, and depending on who you're really talking about, Macho Man Randy Savage, one of the greatest artists of all time, easily. He would map out his matches a lot more, but usually the finish was mapped out or what have you. But lots and lots and lots of times, a vast majority of this whole story is just beat by beat is improvised. And they even break it down beat by beat. You call them spots. You have a whole match, but beat by beat they're called spots. This is a good spot. This is a good spot. So they'll a lot of them will map out the finish, the final spot, the big final spot. But a lot of the spots in between are just improvised. You might map out a lot of the high spots, just the big moments. But usually it's the finish is almost always the one thing that they map out. So amazing artists. If they were dancers, if they were doing ballet, they would get huge respect. I imagine ballet dancers going town to town and improvising the whole thing. The Nicholas Brothers could do that, or they're not ballet dancers, but the Nicholas Brothers could do it. But imagine, just purely improvised dance that told a story, traveling from town to town, most of the days of the year. It's just, amazing artistry. But I don't want to gush too much. But, that's essentially what it is. It is ballet. It's not that far removed from ballet, except that most of it is improvised. And it's, violent ballet, essentially. But work, the whole primacy of the whole word work is very admirable. But work means something that is part of the narrative. It's, fake in the pejorative term, but it's part of the narrative. Any sort of story is, if you called it fake, that would be ridiculously off point. But it is a work. Shoot is just anything that it is real. Somebody's a shooter, means they're a real fighter, or something. If an actual fight breaks out, that's a shoot fight. Somebody might go stiff. That's another sort of terminology that it doesn't really play out. Necessarily in narrative fiction, but you can look at what elements within a narrative are a work and what elements are a shoot. What elements are a worked shoot? Pretty much everything in narrative fiction might be a worked shoot. But if something is biographical that you're integrating into a story, like I'm writing a lot of stories based in high school just by coincidence. How much of that is a work, and how much of that is a shoot, and how much of it is a work shoot. And you might say work shoot corresponds like with breaking the fourth wall, for example, or meta narrative. And meta narrative, meta narrative is a fine terminology. It sort of goes broadly, but it's not nearly as inefficient a term as breaking the fourth wall is. But I like work shoot in the sense that if you have a meta narrative, which seems to be breaking with the illusion that what you're presenting is true, you're convincing someone to come into the narrative reality. You present something as real. If you think of Slaughterhouse-Five, Slaughterhouse-Five, one of my favorite deeply meta novels, one of the most famous deeply meta novels, or Breakfast of Champions. Kurt Vonnegut does this all the time. In Breakfast of Champions, he, I don't need you in my face. I love you, but I don't need you in my face. But in Breakfast of Champions, there's a scene where he meets Kilgore Trout, and he sets Kilgore Trout free. One of my favorite scenes in a novel in Breakfast of Champions. Or the opening of Slaughterhouse-Five. He talks about, here's the process of writing the book. How much of that... Thank you. I love you. How much of that... Yes, you are cute. How much of that is a work? You want to be the star of the show? How much of that is a work, and how much of that is a shoot, and how much of that is a work shoot? So real simple terminology when it comes to... Stop. Real simple terminology when it comes to what is quote unquote reality. I've always hated that as a term. What is quote unquote fake, which is what is quote unquote fictional. But if you think about what is work, work, it's worked. It's treated as a narrative. You're convincing the audience that it's real. What is a shoot? What is actually biographical? But what is presented as biographical but is not biographical, that sort of thing. Simple terminology for a lot of these factors in a piece of fiction. But I think the thing that wrestling fans and wrestlers have much more complicated understanding of than pretty much any other art form. Like I said, it's basically ballet. Doesn't get it nearly as much respect as ballet. But in ballet, you don't have... Oh, God, just get down. There you go. In ballet, that was a little ballet right there. Little dog ballet. You're going to knock my phone over now. In ballet, you don't have complicated terminology to describe audience reaction. And I think that's one of the places where wrestling as an art form just has an admirable amount of self-reflection. Just an amazing amount of self-reflection. And that's where you get the whole linguistic complication of the pop and heat. The pop and heat. Are you going to start barking at me? Are you going to start barking at me? You just can't stand it if you're not the center of attention all the time. Okay, sit still. Everybody sit still. Pop and heat. And the pop and heat, from a linguist, is an interesting situation, because it seems like they might be opposite. Just from a cursory glance, just as terminology, it seems like pop and heat are opposite things. Pop is a count noun. Heat is a non-count noun, which makes it really awkward. A pop, just, a singular pop, is a positive audience reaction. And it's something that you can elicit, like a high spot will elicit a pop. And you can identify that just in any sort of narrative. You're popping the crowd. You can use it as a verb, too. You're popping the crowd. A high spot will pop the crowd. And that's something that you could definitely do in a narrative. If you look at, I talked about this in an early episode. They're just going crazier than normal because it seems like I'm talking to someone else. And they're just jealous that I'm not paying attention to them. You hush. Hush, hush, hush. I talked about this in an early episode, and I referenced like Michael Bay is the obvious example here. Michael Bay, just in his stories, will have tons of high spots. There won't be any sort of psychology. As you know, this is the wrestling term. Psychology is the much more intricate, subtle sort of storytelling. Um, but Michael Bay will have all these high spots, and it gets really tedious. Wrestling terminology can explain just why Michael Bay doesn't work very easily. You have too many high spots. You don't have enough psychology. Um, the subtle storytelling is missing. Um, as I said, wrestling understands narrative much better than so many other art forms. Um, but high spots will pop the crowd, so they'll get a positive response from the crowd. But just classic wrestling psychology, you recognize that's fleeting. You can only get so far with just popping the crowd with high spots. And there's plenty of things that will pop the crowd. You get cheap pops and that stuff like that. But heat is the far more complicated thing. And just your average wrestling fan will meditate on just the sound of the crowd. What sort of sound is the crowd making? I watched this video. I watched plenty of these videos, but I watched this video on some wrestling commentators, doing just a review of a show. They spent something like 20 minutes just talking about trying to figure out the response that Bailey was getting. Bailey's a current wrestler. And the reason why it was so confusing was because Bailey was presented as a face, but she was getting heat. And so they were trying to figure out, why is she getting heat? And heat is a negative response, but heat can be any kind of response. That's kind of the complicated thing about heat. You can a great feud will get lots of heat, but that doesn't mean it's negative response. It just means it's any kind of response. So it could be a general term for positive and negative, and it can be it refers most often to negative response. So there's a primacy placed on negative response. And that's a basic principle of the rainbow circle. Let's consult the rainbow circle, as we always must. That's a basic principle of the rainbow circle. The center here is visceral response regardless of positive or negative response. And the value in wrestling storytelling is strong response. It doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. Negative is sometimes a lot stronger than positive. Getting heat, it's sometimes it's easier to get heat, or it's much stronger, it's more potent, it's more complicated to get heat. Pops tend to be just these brief things, usually. And you can pop a crowd by having a comeback spot or something like that. But heat is much more long sustaining sort of response. And the complexity of heat, I think the complexity of heat has a lot to do with just the complexity of the crowd. People will dismiss wrestling crowds as dumb, but they're not dumb at all. There's far more meta-analysis of crowd response from wrestling crowds. And that has to do with just the complexity of just the different types of crowds. You have the true marks, and they're really defined by how you arguably, they're defined by how you respond to faces and heels. And faces and heels, that's a schema. That's that third level. The first level is definitely, there's a whole complex understanding of how that first level works, the visceral response. The faces and heels are really just a narrative schema. There's a whole set of expectations that you have for a face. A face is a good guy, or a good gal. I don't know, a good female wrestler. And Bailey was presented as a face. A baby face is another word for it. There's a whole set of expectations. Babyface won't cheat. Babyface usually is an underdog. There's all kinds of narrative elements within the storytelling that really are directly related to being a face. A heel is a bad guy or a bad female wrestler also. And I think Bailey was fighting. I don't remember who Bailey was fighting when I saw this probably Alexa Bliss. Alexa Bliss was one of the top female heels. Although I guess she's a face. That's a lot of the discussion is she being treated? Is this particular wrestler being treated as a face or a heel? And then a heel is a bad guy, and a bad guy will cheat, and it will have this particular role within the narrative. If the face is the underdog, the heel will slow down the match, and there's all kinds of just really basic understanding. Okay, be still. There's all kinds of really essential understanding of just the role of a heel in the narrative of the match. Okay, the role of the heel in the narrative of the match. The narrative of the match. And it's designed just by evolution over 100 years. Optimizes heat, or it optimizes the pop. It optimizes the crowd response. And the crowd is not responding because they're stupid. The crowd is responding because that's the nature of the narrative. So true marks will respond to heels by booing and faces by cheering. Because a true mark thinks that all of this is real. And that's just kids usually. A casual fan will respond essentially the same way. But they just are enjoying it as a story. And casual fans, I was a casual fan at one point too. Casual fans will still say, I hate that Miz, or I hate, whoever's the heel, Baron Corbin or somebody like that. I hate that Baron Corbin. He's such a butthead. Or Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar came in and just threw Rey Mysterio and his son around just the other day. And they'll say, I hate that Brock Lesnar because he's so mean to Rey Mysterio. They're just, they're getting caught up in the narrative. They realize they're characters. Brock Lesnar's... Okay. Stop. Brock Lesnar is also a real person, but he's also playing a character named Brock Lesnar. And Rey Mysterio, clearly not his real name, but he's playing a character named Rey Mysterio. And his son, Dominic, stop. Brock Lesnar threw them all around. And so a casual fan will say, that darn Brock Lesnar. Even though they know it, they're just characters. Smart marks will recognize, have this meta-level recognition that the writers, the bookers, the performers all got together and created this narrative that Brock Lesnar is trying to get heat from the crowd. And smart marks, depending on what kind of smart mark you're talking about, a lot of people will separate smart marks from smarks. Smarks tend to, it's a newer development. They tend to respond